Do you take Ethan Cross to be your lawfully wedded husband? The officiant's words hung in the air of the Whitmore Grand Ballroom, swallowed by 300 pairs of eyes and a dozen live-stream cameras beaming the moment to shareholders who cared more about the merger than the marriage. Ethan Cross stood at the altar in a black tux that fit like armor, his jaw tight, his hands folded in front of him like a man bracing for impact rather than a vow. Bianca Whitfield smiled up at him. He didn't smile back. "I do," she said. The officiant turned to Ethan. "And do you?" The doors at the back of the ballroom slammed open. Not the bride's entrance. The wrong doors, the wrong moment, wind and rain bleeding in from the hotel lobby. 3 boys stood in the frame. Identical, maybe 8 years old, hand in hand, soaked at the shoulders like they'd run the last block. The room didn't gasp so much as inhale all at once and forget to exhale. The boys walked down the aisle like they'd rehearsed it 100 times and still weren't sure they had the courage. 300 guests turned their heads in a single wave. Bianca's bouquet trembled in her grip. The tallest of the 3 stopped at the base of the altar steps and looked straight up at Ethan. "Are you our dad?" The words landed soft. That was the worst part, no accusation in them, no theater. Just a question a child had clearly practiced in a mirror somewhere, hoping the answer would be simple. Ethan's mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at the boy's face, his own eyes staring back at him, down to the exact fleck of gold near the left pupil that his mother used to call the cross mark, and something in his chest folded in on itself. Bianca's voice cracked first. "Ethan. Ethan, who are they?" He didn't answer her either. He couldn't. He was still looking at the boy, and the boy was still waiting, patient in the way only children who've been lied to gently their whole lives learn to be patient. "I don't," Ethan started. "I've never seen." "Don't answer that, Ethan." The voice came from the back of the room, low and steady enough to cut clean through 300 whispers. Every head turned again, cameras swiveling with them, and there, framed in the doorway with rain still dark on the shoulders of his coat, stood a man Ethan hadn't let himself think about in 8 years. Not on purpose, not out loud, not even in the quiet, dangerous hour before sleep. Rowan Kang. He looked older. Tired in a way that lived behind the eyes instead of on the surface. But he stood the same way he always had, like he'd rather be anywhere else, and like he wasn't going anywhere until this was finished. "Rowan." Ethan's voice barely made it out of his throat. "You don't get to meet them like this," Rowan said, and it wasn't cruelty in his tone. It was something closer to grief, worn smooth from being carried too long. He turned toward the doors, toward the rain, like he intended to walk right back out of Ethan's life the same way he'd walked out of it once before, without a word of warning either time. If a wedding can fall apart in 60 seconds, imagine what the next chapter does to it. Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment everything gets worse, before it gets impossibly better. One of the boys broke free of his brother's hands and bolted. Not toward Rowan, not toward the doors, but forward up the aisle, past the stunned officiant, straight toward the altar. Small shoes slapping marble. 300 guests frozen mid-breath. "Dad, wait!" The word detonated through the ballroom like a struck bell, and for one suspended second nobody moved, because everyone, Bianca included, assumed the boy was calling after the man retreating toward the door. He wasn't. He was looking straight up at Ethan, arms already reaching, eyes wet and certain in a way 8-year-olds shouldn't have to be certain about anything. And Ethan Cross, CEO, groom, a man who hadn't cried in a boardroom in a decade, went down on one knee at the altar and caught him. "Sir, I need you to step back." Security closed around Rowan before he reached the door, 2 men in black suits with hands raised, not touching him but boxing him and all the same. He didn't fight it. He just looked past them at the boy still folded in Ethan's arms at the altar, and something in his face cracked open and shut again in the space of a breath. "Clear the room." Marcus Cross was already on his feet, silver-haired and ashen, waving toward the cameras like he could physically push the broadcast back into its box. "Family only. Cut the feed, cut it now." Nobody cut it in time. By the time a hotel staffer yanked the live stream cable, the clip was already looping across a dozen phones in the ballroom, already climbing some algorithm that didn't care whose life it was ruining. 8 years earlier. Rain against a studio window. Rowan, 22, ink-stained fingers smoothing a blueprint across a drafting table in a cramped apartment that smelled like coffee and turpentine. Ethan sat across from him, tie loosened, jacket slung over a stool that didn't match anything else in the room. "Your father's going to disown you," Rowan said, not looking up. "My father's going to need me," Ethan said. "Not the other way around." After the merger closes, I tell him. About us. About everything. He reached across the table, tipped Rowan's chin up with one finger. I'm not ashamed of you. I'm being strategic. That's a very CEO way of saying scared. Say yes to strategic and I'll make you dinner. Rowan had laughed, actually laughed, the kind that softened his whole face, and believed him. That was the part that would hurt the most later. Not the vanishing. The believing. Present. The private room off the ballroom was small, soundproofed, built for board disputes, not this. Ethan shut the door behind them, and for a moment neither man spoke, 8 years of silence suddenly loud in four walls. You told me to disappear, Rowan said first, voice flat, rehearsed like he'd said it in his head 1,000 times and needed it to sound less like it was killing him. You had Kessler pay me to leave the country. Do you know what that did to me? Alone, pregnant, in a city where I didn't speak the language. I never did that. Ethan's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against the table to stop it. I searched for 2 years, Rowan. Private investigators. Every hospital, every shelter, every name change I could think of. You vanished. No note. No number. Nothing. Don't. Rowan's voice cracked on the word. Don't stand there and lie to my face after everything. I'm not lying. Ethan stepped closer. Close enough that Rowan had to tip his head up the same way he had 8 years ago in a rain-streaked apartment that no longer existed. I would never send you away. I built my whole life around telling my father about you. For the first time, something in Rowan's certainty wavered. Not because Ethan sounded convincing, but because he sounded broken in exactly the shape Rowan had spent 8 years being broken himself. 2 people, 2 truths, one impossible gap between them. What happened 8 years ago, and who's been lying the whole time? Hit subscribe because Chapter 3 starts pulling that thread loose. Rowan reached into his coat with a hand that wasn't quite steady and pulled out a letter. Folded so many times the creases had gone soft as fabric, the paper yellowed at the edges. He held it out like it weighed more than it should. Then explained this. Ethan took it, unfolded it, read 3 lines, and the color drained out of his face like someone had pulled a plug. Take the money. Don't contact my family again. EC. I never wrote this. His voice had gone hollow. He turned the page over, hands trembling now for a different reason. And there, pressed into the paper in ink that didn't match the rest, was a corporate authorization stamp. Small. Official. The kind only 3 people at Cross Holdings had ever been issued. Hidden inside the seal, barely legible unless you knew to look, 2 initials that weren't his. DC. Are they mine? Ethan's voice broke on the last word, barely more than breath. He was still holding the letter, still staring at the stamp that shouldn't exist. But none of it mattered next to the question that had been sitting in his chest since the ballroom doors opened. Rowan's jaw tightened. Triplets. Born 7 months after I left. He said it plainly, like a fact he'd repeated to himself so many times it had stopped being able to hurt him. Except it clearly still did. I worked 3 jobs. Told them their father was gone before they could remember to ask why. I didn't tell them your name until last week. Why last week? Because our oldest found a photo I should have burned a long time ago. Rowan's eyes finally lifted to meet his. The engagement one. From the rooftop, the night you promised me the merger, remember? I kept it in a box I told myself I'd never open again. Ethan closed his eyes. He remembered. He remembered every detail of that rooftop. The city lights, the ring he hadn't bought yet, the promise he'd never gotten the chance to keep. Outside the private room, the 3 boys sat in a row of gilded chairs meant for wedding guests, small legs swinging, not touching the untouched cake someone had wheeled past. The middle one leaned into the eldest, voice hushed the way children get when they've learned adult silence usually means something's wrong. Why is everyone so sad? He asked. Isn't this supposed to be happy? Nobody answered him. Nobody could. Ethan stepped out first, and for a moment he just stood there, tall and formal in a tux that suddenly felt like a costume. Then he did something none of his board members, his father, or 300 wedding guests had ever seen him do. He lowered himself to the floor, knees against marble, until he was eye level with 3 versions of himself he hadn't known existed an hour ago. I'm Ethan, he said quietly. What are your names? The eldest studied him like he was deciding whether the question deserved an answer. I'm Theo. That's Milo. That's Sam. Theo. Milo. Sam. Ethan repeated each one like he was memorizing something sacred. I'm sorry I wasn't there to ask sooner. Milo, the quiet one, tilted his head. Are you going to leave again? The question landed harder than anything Diane's forged letter had said. Ethan didn't flinch from it, though everything in him wanted to. "No," he said. "I'm not going anywhere. 3 names. 1 promise he intends to keep, if the people around him will let him. Subscribe now, because the next reveal changes everything you think you know about who's really behind this." Backstage, past a wall of untouched floral arrangements, Bianca found Diane checking her phone with a composure that didn't match the chaos 3 feet away. "Did you know?" Bianca's voice shook, not from tears but fury. "Did you know about those boys?" "Of course not." Diane didn't look up from her screen. "I'm as blindsided as you are." "Then why," Bianca said, stepping closer, "does your face look like someone who already grieved this an hour before it happened?" Diane finally met her eyes, calm, too calm, a stillness practiced rather than felt. "Grief looks different on people who've had to hold this family together their whole lives, Bianca. I'd expect a bride to know the difference between shock and control." She walked away before Bianca could answer, heels sharp against marble, giving nothing else. In a records room 3 floors below, Mr. Kessler pulled the resignation file from the Cross Holdings archive himself, fingers steady out of habit rather than confidence. He scanned the access log twice before he let himself believe it. Last accessed, 2 days ago. Not 8 years. 2 days. Someone had reopened this file right before the wedding, right before the boys walked through those doors, which meant none of this was an accident at all. Back in the private room, Ethan turned to Rowan one final time, the letter still trembling faintly in his grip. "Who gave you this?" His voice had gone low, dangerous in a way Rowan hadn't heard from him since the night he proposed. "Who paid you to leave?" Rowan hesitated, eyes flicking toward the door like the answer might follow him out of it if he said it too loud. "Your father's attorney," he said finally. "Kessler. He handed it to me himself." "You knew." Ethan's voice filled the chairman's office before the door had fully closed behind him. Marcus Cross stood behind his desk, hands braced against its edge like it was the only thing keeping him upright. "I never ordered anyone paid off," Marcus said. "I swear to you, Ethan, I never." "That's not what I asked." Ethan's jaw was tight, his eyes rimmed red from a night that had aged him 10 years in a single evening. "I asked if you knew he existed. If you knew about Rowan, and you let me spend 2 years thinking he abandoned me." Marcus's silence answered before he did. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all its boardroom command. "I found out 4 years ago. A photograph from an associate who recognized him at an architecture conference. I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. The merger was fragile. I thought—" He stopped, shame settling into the lines of his face like something permanent. "I thought silence was mercy. Silence isn't mercy." Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. "Silence is just a slower kind of lying." Down in the hotel's storage wing, Rowan knelt over a box of old files Kessler's assistant had carelessly left unlocked, searching less for evidence than for some thread of sense in a night that had none. His fingers stilled on a business card wedged in a folder, cream cardstock, embossed gold lettering, Kessler and Voss, Special Holdings Division. He turned it over twice. Cross Holdings had no Special Holdings Division. Not now. Not, according to the card's date stamp, 8 years ago either, which meant it had been invented quietly for exactly one purpose. Backstage, Bianca found Diane refastening an earring in a mirror, composure fully restored, as if the last hour hadn't happened to her at all. "You've known about those boys longer than today," Bianca said, arms crossed. "Your face didn't move once. Not when they walked in, not when Ethan broke, not once. I told you. Shock affects people differently." Diane didn't turn from the mirror. "That's not shock, Diane. That's rehearsal." For half a second, something flickered behind Diane's eyes, quickly smoothed, but Bianca caught it, filed it away like a woman finally waking up to her own wedding. One sister who won't crack. One attorney with a card that shouldn't exist. Subscribe now, because the next 5 minutes decide who's really been pulling the strings. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Ethan found the small lounge off the ballroom. Rowan asleep upright in a wingback chair, still in his rain-damp coat, Theo, Milo, and Sam curled together on the couch beside him like a single tangled knot of exhaustion. Ethan stood in the doorway a long moment, just looking, the way a man looks at something he thought he'd never be allowed to see again. He didn't wake him. He found a spare blanket folded on a shelf near the door and laid it gently over Rowan's shoulders instead. Rowan's eyes opened anyway, slow, unguarded, still half inside a dream. For one suspended second neither of them spoke. No accusation, no 8 years of silence between them. Just the quiet fact of Ethan crouched close enough to touch and Rowan too tired to build the wall back up in time. Ethan's hand hovered near Rowan's jaw, not quite closing the distance. Rowan didn't pull away. Then, softly, Rowan's eyes drifted shut again, and Ethan stayed exactly where he was until dawn started bleeding gray through the curtains. Neither of them saying a word, because for once, nothing needed to be said. By morning, Kessler stood in the chairman's office, summoned, composed, a man who'd spent 30 years being the family's most trusted secret keeper. Marcus slid the shell account documents across the desk without a word. "Explain this." Kessler didn't flinch. He adjusted his cufflinks with the same calm he'd have used to review a contract. "I arranged the payment to Mr. Kang 8 years ago. The letter, the account, all of it." Ethan's breath went shallow. "On whose order?" For the first time, something like hesitation crossed Kessler's face. Not guilt, but calculation, the look of a man deciding how much truth the room could survive. "I answer to Diane." "Say it to my face, Diane." Ethan closed the office door behind him, and for the first time all night, Diane didn't reach for her phone or her composure. She just looked at him, tired, finally, in a way that made her look less like the boardroom's sharpest weapon and more like someone who'd been carrying something heavy for far too long. "You want me to say it?" Her voice cracked open, 8 years of pressure behind it. "Fine. I'll say it. I was 12 when father started grooming me to run this company. 12, Ethan. Board meetings instead of birthday parties. I memorized shareholder reports before I learned to drive. And when the seat finally opened, they didn't give it to the one who earned it. They gave it to the son. That's not on me." Ethan's voice stayed low, controlled, though his hands weren't. "I never asked for the seat over you. You didn't have to ask. You were born into it." Diane's eyes glistened, fury and grief tangled together. "And then you were about to throw the whole company into scandal over some boy from architecture school. I removed the variable, Ethan. That's all it was supposed to be. A variable." Her voice thinned. "I didn't know there'd be children. I didn't know it would go this far. I just wanted, for once, to be the one who saved this family instead of the one who got skipped." It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't even really an apology. It was worse, the truth, ugly and human, impossible to hate cleanly. In the hallway, Rowan stood frozen just outside the door, one hand flat against the wall, listening to a fight he was never meant to overhear. He heard Ethan's voice again, quieter now, stripped of anger. "I would have given up the company for him, Diane. Do you understand that? I would have walked away from all of it, the seat, the merger, the name, and never looked back. You didn't just take him from me. You took the only thing I ever wanted more than any of this." Something in Rowan's chest broke open at that. Not the wound reopening, but a wall he'd built brick by brick over 8 years finally giving way. He'd spent so long believing Ethan chose the company. He'd never once considered that Ethan had been ready to choose him. One confession just rewrote everything this story is about. Subscribe now, because the next reveal decides whether this family survives the truth or drowns in it. Bianca found Ethan in the corridor minutes later, her wedding dress still on, though it now looked like a costume from someone else's life. She didn't cry. She just looked at him with the calm of someone who'd already made peace with what she was about to say. "I'm postponing the wedding," she said. "Indefinitely." "Bianca, don't." She held up a hand, not unkind. "I'm not angry. I watched you on your knees for a little boy who called you dad before you ever called me anything close to that. This was never about me, Ethan. I think some part of me always knew it wasn't." She touched his arm once, briefly. "Go fix your family. I hope you do." Back in the office, Diane's composure had returned, sharpened now into something colder. She'd had time to think, and thinking, for Diane, always meant leverage. "You have one option left to protect this company," she said, voice flat and precise. "Deny them. Publicly. Tell the press those boys aren't yours, that this was a fabricated scandal, and I'll bury the story before the shareholder vote. I even have documents ready. Custody records painting Rowan as unstable. Unfit. It writes itself, Ethan. All you have to do is say the word." Ethan didn't blink. "No." Diane studied him for a long moment, and then, almost gently, she smiled. The smile of someone who'd expected exactly this answer and had already planned 3 steps past it. "Then you leave me no choice." She picked up her phone, thumb already moving across the screen, and pressed it to her ear without looking away from him once. "We need to leave. Now." Rowan was already zipping the boys' bags when Ethan found him at dawn, the hotel's suite a mess of half-folded clothes and a phone screen glowing with the headline that had broken overnight. Gold digger groom. Ex-lover plants triplets at cross wedding for payout. Fabricated custody documents sat beneath it. Time to detonate 2 hours before markets opened. Rowan, stop. Ethan caught his wrist, gentle but firm. Don't. Rowan yanked back, hands shaking as he shoved a small shirt into a duffel bag. This is exactly what happened before. I stayed too long, trusted too much, and it cost me 8 years. I'm not doing it again. I'm taking them and I'm gone. That's exactly what they want. Ethan's voice cracked, stripped of every ounce of composure the boardroom had ever taught him. Running is what proves the story true, Rowan. Don't give them that. He stepped closer, closing the space between them until there was nowhere left for either of them to hide. Stay. Let me fix this. With you. Not for you. I'm done doing things to you instead of with you. Rowan's hands stilled on the zipper. He didn't look up, but he didn't move toward the door either. 8 years of self-preservation cracked, just slightly, against 8 words he hadn't known he needed to hear. In the hallway outside, Kessler waited with a folder pressed flat against his chest like it might burn through his suit. When Ethan stepped out, Kessler didn't offer explanations. Just handed it over, eyes down, a man finally choosing conscience over comfort a decade too late. Wire transfer, Kessler said quietly. From Diane's personal account to the shell company that owns the tabloid. Sent 2 hours before the story broke. He met Ethan's eyes once, briefly. I should have brought you the truth 8 years ago. I'm bringing it now instead. By 9 a.m., the board had convened an emergency session, stock ticking downward in real time on the screen behind the long mahogany table. Marcus stood at the head of the room before Ethan even arrived, voice steady for the first time in the entire ordeal. Whatever comes next, Marcus said to the assembled directors, my son has my full support. Not because he's my son. Because he's right. 1 folder. 1 wire transfer. 1 family about to implode on camera. Subscribe now, because the next 5 minutes decide who walks out of that boardroom standing. Ethan walked in with the folder gripped tight in one hand, the weight of it steadying him more than any speech he'd rehearsed. He'd pictured this moment a dozen times overnight, laying the transfer records on the table, watching Diane's careful mask finally shatter in front of everyone who'd ever underestimated her. He set the folder down, opened it. Empty. Not misplaced. Emptied, deliberately, cleanly, every page gone. His pulse spiked. He flipped it over once, twice, as if the papers might reappear through sheer disbelief. A slow, deliberate clap echoed from the head of the table. Diane was already seated, unhurried, a folder of her own resting neatly in front of her. The original documents, Ethan realized with a cold drop in his stomach, not copies. Hers. Looking for these? She asked, sliding 1 finger across the folder's edge, smiling like a woman who'd known this exact confrontation was coming and had simply arrived early enough to win it. Let's be honest about what's happening here. Diane rose from her seat, folder in hand, addressing the board with the same composed authority she'd spent 8 years perfecting. My brother fabricated financial documents this morning to smear me, his own sister, because he'd rather destroy this family than admit his personal scandal is exactly that. Personal. An illegitimate family he's now trying to launder through corporate sabotage accusations. A murmur rippled down the table. A few directors exchanged glances, half convinced. The boardroom doors opened. Rowan walked in first, uninvited, unstoppable, 3 small figures falling into step behind him. Theo, Milo, and Sam, hands linked the way they always stood when the world felt too big. The room went silent in a different register this time. Not scandal, but something rawer. Rowan didn't raise his voice. They're not a scandal. He looked directly at Diane, steady, unblinking. Look at them. Look at their faces. And say that again. Nobody moved. Diane's mouth opened, but nothing polished came out this time. Kessler stood slowly from his chair at the far end of the table, 30 years of careful loyalty visibly cracking across his face. I have something to add, he said, voice steadier than he felt. On the record. He looked at Marcus, then at Ethan, then finally, unflinchingly, at Diane. 8 years ago, Diane Cross personally ordered the payment that removed Rowan Kang from this family. This week, she ordered the wire transfer that funded the tabloid story naming him unfit. I have the documentation. I should have brought it forward the day she first asked me to hide it. The room turned to Diane as one. One confession. One family exposed in front of the people who trusted it most. Subscribe now, because what she says next changes who you thought the real villain was. For a moment, Diane said nothing. Then her composure, the mask she'd worn through every scene of this story, finally slipped, not into fury but into something far more exhausting to watch. I did everything right. Her voice shook, stripped bare. 12 years old and already learning shareholder language. Every promotion earned twice over, because a woman had to prove it, every holiday spent in this building instead of a house. And it still wasn't enough. Her eyes glistened, and for the first time all story, she looked less like a villain and more like a woman who'd run out of road. Nobody ever asked what I lost becoming what this family needed. Silence. Even Ethan, jaw tight, didn't have an answer for that. The chairman of the board, an older man who'd watched 3 generations of cross-family drama unfold across that same table, cleared his throat. Ms. Cross, given the evidence presented, the board has no choice but to call for your immediate removal, pending full investigation. Security entered without being summoned twice. Diane didn't fight them. She let herself be walked toward the door with a strange, terrible calm, like she'd already grieved this outcome long before it arrived. At the threshold, she stopped. She turned back, not toward the board, not toward Rowan or the boys, but straight at Ethan, and what she said wasn't shouted, wasn't even angry. It was worse. It was quiet. You think this ends because I'm gone? A faint, humorless smile. Ask your father what he signed 8 years ago. Ask him why the payment came from a joint account. She walked out. The doors closed behind her. Every eye in the room turned to Marcus. He didn't deny it. He didn't say anything at all. He simply closed his eyes, and in that silence, the boardroom understood exactly how much of the truth still hadn't been spoken. The joint account is real, isn't it? Ethan stood across from his father in the empty chairman's office, the boardroom's ghosts still clinging to the walls. Marcus didn't sit. He looked older than he had that morning, like the last hour had stripped a decade off whatever composure remained. It's real, Marcus said quietly. But it's not what you think. Then tell me what it is. Marcus's hands trembled at his sides. 8 years ago, Diane came to me with evidence, bank records, emails, all of it convincingly built, that Rowan had taken money from a rival firm to leak our merger data, that the relationship with you was cover for corporate espionage. He met Ethan's eyes, and something in them was pleading, desperate to be understood rather than forgiven. I believed her. I thought I was protecting you from being used by someone who never loved you at all. I signed the payment myself, thinking I was saving my son. It was fabricated. Ethan's voice had gone hollow. All of it. Diane invented a spy story to end my relationship, and you signed off on destroying 2 lives because you were afraid of losing a merger. I didn't know. Marcus's voice cracked, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, the composed chairman of Cross Holdings broke completely in front of his son. I thought I was protecting you. I didn't know I was the one who ended it. Ethan said nothing. There was nothing clean to say. His father hadn't been a villain, just a man who'd been played by someone he trusted, and the damage was exactly as real either way. Down the hall, Rowan heard the confession secondhand from Kessler, delivered in careful, guilty fragments. He sat with it in silence, jaw tight, staring at nothing. 8 years he'd spent hating a man for staying quietly complicit, and the truth was messier than hatred allowed for. Marcus hadn't chosen silence out of cowardice. He'd been lied to as thoroughly as Rowan had. Forgiveness didn't arrive easily. It didn't arrive at all, not yet. But the hatred, at least, had nowhere clean left to stand. Every truth in this story costs someone something. Subscribe now, because the next revelation costs more than anyone expected. Ethan found Rowan on the hotel balcony well past midnight, the city glittering cold and indifferent below them. He didn't say anything as he approached. No apology, no explanation, nothing performative. He just sat down beside him on the stone ledge, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and let the silence hold what words couldn't. Rowan didn't move away. Minutes passed. The wind carried the faint sound of traffic far below, and somewhere in that quiet, something in Rowan's guarded posture finally gave. He leaned, almost without deciding to, until his shoulder rested against Ethan's. The first willing touch in 8 years, small and involuntary and enormous all at once. Neither of them spoke. Nothing was resolved. Not the letter, not the years, not the ache still sitting between them like a wound too old to close overnight. But for the first time since the ballroom doors had opened, they sat together instead of across from each other, and that alone felt like the beginning of something neither of them was ready to name yet. Ethan's hand found Rowan's on the cold stone ledge, fingers barely brushing. Rowan didn't pull away. The moment held, fragile, unclaimed, theirs. Then Rowan's phone rang, harsh and sudden against the quiet, the screen lighting up with a number he didn't recognize. "It's the school," he said, frowning, already answering. "This late?" Ethan watched Rowan's face change in real time. Confusion sharpening into alarm, alarm collapsing into something closer to panic. "What do you mean he never came back?" Rowan's voice rose, unsteady. "He told me he was at a study group." "What study group?" "There isn't a—" He stood so fast the phone nearly slipped from his hand. "Since when?" Ethan was already on his feet. "Rowan, what happened?" Rowan lowered the phone slowly, his face drained of every color it had regained in the last hour. "Theo's missing. Pull up the footage. Now." The school's security office smelled like burnt coffee and panic. Ethan leaned over the monitor, Rowan gripping the edge of the desk hard enough to whiten his knuckles, as a grainy feed showed Theo slipping out a side door alone, backpack slung over one shoulder, walking with the deliberate pace of a child who knew exactly where he was going. "There." Rowan's finger jabbed the screen. "The train station. He's headed to the train station. Alone." Ethan's voice was tight, controlled panic. At 8 years old, they didn't discuss who would drive. They just ran together, out into a night that felt colder than it had any right to be in early autumn. The station attendant remembered him, a small boy who'd asked, very seriously, for directions to Ashford Street, clutching a folded, yellowed piece of paper like a map. Rowan's breath caught. "That's the letter." His voice cracked. He took the letter. Ashford Street. Ethan was already moving toward the car. "I know exactly where that is." The old architecture building hadn't changed much in 8 years. Same ivy climbing the brick, same crooked sign over the door that neither of them had bothered to fix back when it was theirs to fix. Ethan's headlights swept across the entrance and caught a small figure sitting on the front steps, knees pulled to his chest, the letter still clutched in one hand. Rowan was out of the car before it fully stopped. "Theo." The boy looked up, startled, guilty, and defiant all at once. The exact combination of expressions Rowan recognized from every mirror he'd avoided for 8 years. "How did you even find this place?" Rowan knelt in front of him, hands shaking as he checked his son over for injuries that weren't there. "The photo." Theo's voice wavered but didn't break. "The one from your box. It had an address on the back." Ethan knelt too, on the other side, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched over their son's small frame. "Theo, you scared us. You can't just disappear like that." "Why not?" The boy's chin lifted, eyes glassy but fierce. "Everyone keeps disappearing. Everyone keeps yelling. I just wanted to see the place where you two used to be happy, because since the wedding, all I've seen is fighting. I wanted to know if it was ever real." Silence dropped over all three of them, heavier than anything the boardroom or the tabloids had managed all week. No adult monologue in this story had landed as hard as 8 words from an 8-year-old who'd been quietly keeping score the whole time. One letter. One address. One question no adult in this story had thought to ask themselves. Subscribe now, because tomorrow brings the reckoning this whole story has been building toward. Ethan reached out first, resting a hand gently on Theo's shoulder. "It was real," he said quietly. "It still is. I'm sorry you ever had to wonder." Rowan pulled his son into his arms, and after a moment's hesitation, Ethan wrapped both of them in his. The first time all 3 of them had stood like that, together, unified instead of fractured. "We're staying," Rowan murmured into his son's hair. "Both of us. I promise." On the drive back, the boys asleep in the back seat, city lights sliding past the windows in long amber streaks. Rowan finally said the thing he'd swallowed since the moment the ballroom doors first opened. "I never stopped loving you." His voice was barely above a whisper, eyes fixed on the road ahead rather than on Ethan beside him. "I just stopped believing it was safe to." Ethan's hand found his on the console, steady this time, certain. "It's safe now," he said. "I'll spend as long as it takes proving that." Rowan didn't answer, but his fingers curled around Ethan's and stayed there the rest of the drive. They pulled up to the hotel expecting quiet. Instead, the entrance was swarming, camera flashes strobing white against the dark, reporters shouting over each other, a mounted television screen in the lobby window replaying a live segment on loop. Diane's face filled the frame, composed, victorious, out on bail and somehow already back in front of a microphone. "I have final proof." Her voice carried through the glass, cool and precise. "Those boys are not biologically Ethan Cross's sons. I'm calling for a public paternity test before tomorrow's shareholder vote reconvenes." Rowan went rigid beside him. Ethan stared through the windshield at his sister's face looming over the crowd, and felt the ground shift beneath them one more time. "I'm calling my own press conference." Ethan said it flatly, standing in the same ballroom where everything had begun, camera crews already resetting for the second broadcast this hotel had hosted in a week. Rowan stood beside him, arms crossed, watching him with something between worry and reluctant faith. "You don't owe her a response," Rowan said. "I'm not responding to her." Ethan adjusted his jacket, steady now in a way he hadn't been all story. "I'm removing her power to control the story at all." By noon, the cameras were rolling live. Ethan stood at the same podium where his wedding vows had once dissolved into chaos, Rowan a few feet behind him. The boys nowhere near the spotlight this time. A boundary Ethan had insisted on himself. "I don't need a test to know they're mine," Ethan said, voice carrying clean and certain across the room. "But I'm asking for one anyway. Not because I have doubts. Because I have nothing left to hide, and I want the truth on record, for them, not for the stock price." The results came back within the hour, exactly as everyone already knew they would. Diane's final claim collapsed on the same screens that had once broadcast her brother's ruined wedding, the story rewriting itself in real time from scandal to vindication. The board convened one last time. Diane's removal was formalized, her name struck from every title she'd once treated as inevitable. Marcus rose, tired but resolute, and announced his own resignation as chairman, passing the seat to Ethan, finally, on merit rather than birth order. "One condition," Ethan said before accepting, looking around the table. "Cross Holdings partners with Kang Architecture on all future design contracts. Not as a favor, because his work is the best in this city, and I won't build anything else without it." Rowan, watching from the doorway, said nothing, but something in his posture, finally, looked like a man standing on solid ground. Every truth finally on the record. Every debt finally paid. Subscribe now, because what comes next is the ending this whole story was written to earn. Months passed. Trust didn't rebuild itself in a single grand gesture. It rebuilt in small ones. Sunday dinners. School pickups Ethan never missed. Quiet mornings where Rowan stopped flinching when Ethan reached for his hand across a table. At Theo, Milo, and Sam's 9th birthday dinner, candlelight flickering over a cake none of them had rushed to blow out, Milo looked up between bites and said at first, easy, unprompted, like it had always been true. "Can you pass the cake, Dad?" He was looking at Ethan. Ethan froze, throat tight, and passed the cake without trusting himself to speak. Across the table, Rowan's eyes were glassy, watching the word land exactly where it had always belonged. That night, Ethan and Rowan stood together on the same hotel balcony where Chapter 8 had first cracked them open, watching the boys chase each other across the courtyard below, breathless laughter rising into the dark. "I never got to ask you properly," Ethan said quietly. 8 years ago. Rowan turned to look at him. "Ask me now." Ethan took his hand, no ring yet, no rehearsed speech, just the truth, plain and unguarded. "Marry me. Not for the company. Not for the press. Just for us, quietly, whenever you're ready." Rowan didn't answer with words. He laced their fingers together instead, slow and certain, and for the first time in 8 years, it felt like the start of something instead of the end of one. Below, Sam glanced up toward the balcony, caught sight of them, and grinned before turning to face the camera head-on. "Can we tell you the other thing that happened at the wedding?"